So a viable tuber to grow into a plant needs three parts to it. It needs the tuber part here, the body. It needs the neck, and then it needs the crown or some eyes on the crown. And in order for it to grow into a plant, it needs those three things.
Here's the quick version on how you divide your dahlia tubers. All the tubers are connected to the crown, which is connected to the stalk. And when we cut the tubers apart, we want to make sure each one has a piece of the crown, it has a nice solid neck, and it has that solid tuber body. Then you're going to cut it just like that and separate it from the larger clump. This single dahlia tuber will now turn into a big plant this summer. And see that little nodule right there? That is the eye. That's where the plant is actually going to grow out of the tuber. When we separate the tubers, we label them right away. Each clump has been labeled. We did that when we took it out of the ground in the fall, but then as we cut the tubers off, we label them as well, because guess what? You cannot tell the tubers apart from each other. They all look so different, and so we always label them to ensure that we don't get them mixed up. Number one, because we do put these in our shop to sell them online so you can purchase them, and we want to make sure that we're sending you the exact flower that you want. And number two, when we go to plant them in our own garden, we want to plant them in a specific way, because some of the dahlia plants are really, really tall and some are shorter. That is the way they grow naturally. And we like to plant them in a specific way in our cutting garden so that those tall ones aren't shading the shorter ones. So even if we weren't selling our tubers, we would still label them, because otherwise it's way too easy to mix them up. After we have labeled the tubers, they go back into the storage bins and we cover them with the wood shavings. And the wood shavings do an amazing job of keeping the moisture balance in the tote so that the dahlia tubers stay happy until we plant them in the spring. One thing that we do in between working with each dahlia clump is that we actually dip our snips into rubbing alcohol, scrub it off, and then we're ready to go. The reason that we do this is because dahlias can carry certain funguses or viruses, and you don't want to accidentally get it from one tuber clump onto the other. So especially if you notice that one of your dahlia tuber clumps was not happy this year, be very, very careful when you're working with it. It's not going to do anything to you, but you could accidentally transfer that fungus or virus to another clump if you don't clean your snips. And so you can see how I'm working with this clump. I cut it in half first, and I basically try to get the clump cut down into bigger chunks, and then I work with those individual chunks so that you're not always having to work with the whole dahlia clump. Now that was the quick version on how to divide your dahlia tubers. If you want to dive into even more dahlia fun, stick around. Erin and I are going to just have a conversation about why we divide our dahlias, and Erin will do a deeper dive with you with some bigger clumps to give you more examples. But we hope you have so much fun dividing all of the beauty from your garden. Share it with your neighbors, share it with your friends. It is incredible how one dahlia plant can turn into so much beauty for so many gardens.
We've been kind of pulling our dahlias out from storage. We stored them back in the end of the fall into winter. And we are just pulling them out and getting ready to start dividing what we have here. And so our goal, just as home gardeners for ourselves, is that we are just trying to get the dahlias out of the ground so that they don't, get ruined over the cold, wet winter. But then as we go to put them back in the ground, we can divide them and get more flowers. And so for our purposes, even just to have a couple more plants as home gardeners is fun. But then we do divide some of ours and sell some of our tubers as well.
So we do store them, which you said. Okay, if you're a home gardener, this is going to come with some caveats, and we'll do more videos later as to why, like all the reasons why you should store them. But the quick reason why we store our tubers is because we live in the Pacific Northwest and our soil stays really, really wet all winter long. And so if we left this tuber clump in the ground, it would just totally rot. Some of you live somewhere where it's really, really cold. And if you left your tuber in the ground, it wouldn't rot because of moisture, but it would freeze, which also kills it. So the reason people dig their dahlia tubers up is because where they're growing their dahlias isn't a good location for them to be through the winter.
Yes, and farmers, the purposes are different for farmers because they're wanting to divide and get as many tubers as they can to spread out their tubers. But for our purposes, it's more for protection.
Yeah, so that's why we store them. So we store ours right here. This is in our garage. They go on this shelf. These bins all have big clumps of tubers in them, so we're working our way through these bins. And then the tubers we cover in wood shavings, and you can buy a block of wood shavings from like your local Tractor Supply store for like $10?
Yeah.
$10. It doesn't cost very much to store them happily, but the key for storing your tubers is they don't want to be hot, they don't want to be wet, and they don't want to be freezing. So you're going for this like...
Or too dry.
Or too dry. So that's why the wood shavings keep it like a really good moisture control, because the wood shavings keep them protected so they're not too cold, not too hot, but it also helps the moisture balance inside the totes. So these totes, it's just a regular plastic Rubbermaid tote. There's nothing special about the tote. We didn't drill holes in it. Our garage is not heated, but it is insulated. So but it's cold out here right now. It's probably 40 degrees.
So it's very cold. Not freezing, but
that's why we store them.
And we store them in just like she said, we use pine shavings. I've heard you're not supposed to use cedar shavings, but you can use pine shavings. Other people use perlite, or some people use peat moss. There's different things, but it's basically wanting to keep the dahlias from getting too wet or too dry, and that helps keep it level.
Yes. Okay, so as a home gardener, the reason we divide our tubers, why do we divide ours as a home gardener?
As a home gardener, we divide them just so we can have more plants. When you pull it out of the ground and you have it out for protection, and it's easily accessible, you may as well just divide it and plant another plant, or divide it and give it to a friend or a family member. Okay, so if you've never gotten a dahlia tuber before, here's the thing, is that dahlia tubers come in all shapes, sizes. They can be really, really big and fat. They can be really skinny. The size of the tuber doesn't necessarily determine how healthy the plant is going to be. It really is just like every plant, there's different varieties. All the tubers look different because they're different varieties of dahlias. So here's the cool thing though, is that when you put this one tuber in the ground, which it just looks like a stick, kind of, or a dried up turd. Little potato.
When you put this one tuber in the ground, during the summer, you see all of this gorgeous like foliage and flowers, and it's doing all of this work above the ground. And then below the ground, this one tuber is multiplying itself. So here's one of the big reasons why home gardeners will divide their dahlias, is because if you're growing them in a pot, these aren't necessarily roots, they're tubers, but it can essentially get root bound in the pot because there's too many tubers in the pot. So you will know that your dahlia needs to be divided if it's no longer producing the same amount of flowers, or the plant, like let's say the last several years it's been super, super healthy, but then this last season you're like, oh, it just looked so sad. I bet it needs to be divided. And when you pull it out of the ground, it is probably gonna be this massive clump, more like this. But this is from one season. So last year we put one tuber in the ground and then it turned into that huge clump.
I mean, it was just like one of these, and after one season it did this. So you can imagine after maybe 2 or 3 years, as these start to multiply out as well, it can get really big, but it can also just turn into this big clump, and they get all intertwined with each other. And that's where you start to run into some inefficiency in the plant.
And if your clump has gotten that big, it is going to be very, very hard for you to divide it down to one tuber. Yeah. And that isn't really the goal. As a home gardener, our goal isn't to just get down to one tuber. Yeah. It's to divide the plant so that it can have space to flourish in the summertime. And so if you have a big, huge clump like this, you can just get a bread knife and just literally cut it into 4 pieces, and then now you have 4 of the same plant, or you can give a clump of it away. But like Erin said, we like to go down to one single tuber because we put these in our shop, and you can order them online, and in March is when the shop will open. And so we have a very small cutting garden. Yeah. In terms of, like, we're not flower farmers. We have 100,
just over 100
plants. And so, but we've taken the time to really curate the colors and the style, and so we love getting to share them with you. So we will have our tubers available in the online shop in March, but you as a home gardener, don't be as concerned that you're getting down to one single tuber. The concern with dividing is that the tuber has what parts?
Yeah, whether or not you're going down to one tuber or you're going to just divide a big clump. A viable tuber has 3 parts. So let's look at this one. The viable tuber has the actual tuber part here. It has a neck right there, and then it has the crown or an eye on the crown. And in order for a tuber to grow into a plant, it needs those 3 things. As we get started on an individual clump, there's a couple things. We like to use a couple different tools. The first thing we use actually are these clippers, a nice pointy pair that can kind of get into small areas. And I think we can link where we get these on the page, but these are the ones we really love. We have a bunch of these. And then a lot of people use, and we've started using as well, a knife. This is like a parrot nose knife. It's very sharp. And this is maybe a little more precise, and it can get you into these crevices when this is hard to get in there. So the other thing that we do is we take some rubbing alcohol and we have it on hand, and in between each clump, just to help safeguard against any kind of virus or disease transferring from one clump to another, we just go ahead and shake it and get some rubbing alcohol on there, and it'll kill any virus that's on there. Same thing with that. So we go ahead and sanitize our tools, and then we have this clump here, and we've kind of cleaned this up already, which we've talked about in other videos. But when you're taking a clump, like say this kind of clump, a big giant clump, a lot of times there's extra roots and little parts that can get in your way. And so it helps to kind of clean up the clump before you try and divide the tubers. Sometimes it's a little bit daunting when you get a bigger clump, or even a clump like this, where you're going, okay, where do I start on this? And so if you clean up the clump with taking off some of the roots and some of the little tubers that you're not going to keep, it can help you find a starting point. I kind of take each clump like it's a puzzle, and so it's kind of, you look at it, and sometimes cleaning it up can kind of give you a clear view of what you're dealing with. A couple things, after you store your tubers or you pull them out of the ground, a lot of times the tuber will break here at the neck, and most tubers that are broken at the neck are not viable. So you would cut them off. Some tubers, if they're cracked but not broken through, might still be viable. And so you could still divide it out if you're just gonna put it in the ground and see if it works. And if it doesn't, then it just fertilizes the garden. But for the most part, like this one here is very questionable. So you just go ahead and go back to the base right here and cut that guy off and get it out of the way. But this guy is The other thing to know when you start with these smaller tubers is kind of a rule of thumb is a viable tuber for size, depending on the variety, is if it's as big as your pinky, kind of in diameter, then it can be a viable tuber. This one is a bit small. This one maybe a bit small. This one could work. It just depends on if it has an eye up here. But that's kind of the starting point. This clump here, a lot of times I will look at the clump and find a spot that I can kind of have the whole clump. So you can see here, there's a spot here where there's not as many tubers and not as many eyes. And then over to the other side, if I come up through here, that's gonna get me in half. So I usually just take my clippers, and I'm being careful not to cut any of the visible eyes. That would be like that right there is an eye, you can see. You stay away from these kind of bulby parts because that's where the eyes usually form. And sometimes they don't form until later in the season before you put them in the ground. But I'm just gonna cut this in half and start there, and that's gonna help me get a little more manageable. And like I said, it can be daunting when you first start, but the key is just do it. You just gotta make a decision and go. And you can be careful, but you don't need to be too worried. It's just a plant, and as long as you have one, you're gonna have the same clump the following year. So from there, we have a more manageable clump, and you can see here, this is part of the crown there. And then this part right here is part of the old stalk. And that is, when we go to clean the whole thing up, we're gonna go ahead and take that out because it can sometimes continue rotting and cause problems. But from there, you can see I have a nice big tuber here, and then there's some eyes in here. It's kind of tough to see because there's some cut off roots, but this whole section is the crown. So I'm gonna go ahead and just cut that guy off. Let's see, I've got my other tool here. And I'm gonna go ahead and just get that in there because that gives me a little more control. And I'm gonna be careful not to cut into the crown more. Okay, so here I have the body, a very fat neck, and then in here, the crown. I'm gonna go ahead and cut off this part of the old stalk that has kind of rotted. It's not necessarily, sometimes the stalk looks rotten, but it's actually just dried out from the end of the season. And you go like that, and there you have one tuber. Now again, we kind of divide them because we do sell them and try and get as many as we can. So if I took this clump right here and said, okay, that's good, and then I got this clump, that would be good. I got two to go in the ground. I just multiplied, and then I take this half and I go, okay, I'm gonna do the same thing, but I'm gonna go ahead and keep going here. I've got, you can see here, there's a tuber and a tuber, and a really clear spot to go in here. And I'm gonna make the decision that these guys under here are not gonna be viable tubers. And probably that little guy is a little too small. So we're gonna go right in here. And this guy, sometimes I'll take off a little guy and just put him in the ground. Let's see what happens. So one thing you can do with questionable ones, and I did this last year just to see, really it was kind of part of learning, is I took a little guy like this. It's kind of questionable. He's got a really thin neck, kind of a small body here, but he does have some eyes right there, right in there. So it could be viable, but I'll just take a tray of seed starter and lay the questionable ones in there and let them be in the temperature where it's like 60 degrees or more, and they will start to form an eye, or they'll sprout if they are viable. And then you can choose to put them in the ground if you want, or give it to a friend. Okay, we'll clean up this last one. It's the idea. You just want to make sure there's no rot in on the crown of the tuber. Sometimes against the stalk there's moisture that gets stuck in there and it starts to rot, and sometimes that can ruin your clump, but sometimes it just is on the inside of the old stalk. So there we go. We have that one. We got this one here, and I'll go ahead and just cut this off because it's not going to help us. It's just going to get in the way. We have that one. This stalk is very hard. So we got that one, and where did our other piece go? Here. We got that one. So from that section, we got 3, and then from this section, if we keep going, we could probably get 3 or 4 more. But that's the general idea with dividing the tubers individually. And if I want, I could take this whole clump and I could put that in the ground, and it'll grow one plant, and then I could say, oh, I got 3 more plants here. That's the general idea. If there's a big clump like this guy, where you're talking, there's 20 or 30 tubers on there, you're not going to get all of those tubers, but you will at least get, 4 chunks you could at the easiest. And then if you want to really go for it, which I will, not in this video, but I will go for it and try and get as many of these as I can. You can really divide these out and multiply them. And this guy's broken. This one you can see is a lot easier. So when they look like this, you pull them out of the ground, you go, oh yes, these are going to be great to cut. Take this clump here. This is the other half of a clump that we divided, and just walk through where I would start with this. Like I said, the ones that are smaller than your pinky are questionable whether they will work or not. There are some smaller varieties that the tubers are very small, and so you want to keep that in mind, that maybe none of them are bigger than your pinky, but that rule of thumb, like if it's about the size of your pinky, could be a viable tuber. So in this case, we have this large one there that I know I can get crown right here. So I'll probably make a cut right there, and then I can see that these guys coming in, that there's some crown with some eyes right here. So I'm going to try and save those separate. And then these guys together, it might be worth just saving these together in one little clump. And then we have these, and I can probably cut those as 2 separate tubers because there's crown there and crown there. And you can see some eyes on there, but that's kind of how I break it down. So I'll start with the easiest one, which I think is probably over here. I'm going to just cut that. This guy right here, just too small. So we'll just cut him, set him aside. These guys here, I'm going to cut right in where that notch is. And then I'm going to kind of cut out this dead stuff. Just in case it wants to cause a problem. So we got 2 there. And then here, like I said, we've got this chunk over here. So if I pull this stuff off, I'll show you. If I make a cut here, and I cut right there, and then I cut down here. Kind of work my way in. And then I'll go to the side here. It's tough to do this in front of the camera. There. So now I have this section here with that big crown piece, and then this here still has this crown there. And that's, even though we had to cut into here, that's still gonna work as one tuber. And then you could take this, and in my case, I'll go ahead and just divide this into 2 little chunks. And these are ones I probably will just put in a tray and see if they'll sprout or not. If they do, then you go, oh, hey, I got 2 more plants. So here we go. We've got this here. And then once I have it to this stage, we label our tubers, each tuber. Some people just put them in bins that are labeled. We go ahead and just label each tuber because I've just had too many times where I'm working with different varieties, and one will get into a pile with some others, and then I go, oh man, I don't remember what that was. And so we just use a very simple method of taking a Sharpie and writing on the side of it. And I might write, this is just write the variety on there. Make sure I label each of these so that when I go and put them either out into the garden, I have a big pile, tray of things I'm taking out, or if we're putting them back in our bins with our pine shavings, that we will be able to find what each one is as we pull them out. So that's how we handle it. And these are ready to go back in. We're going to put these back in storage, back into the pine shavings, because we still have a few months before the ground is going to be warm enough. But these are ready to go back into the ground, or in this case, we would probably sell these guys and put these guys in our little tray and see if they'll sprout. But we'll put them back into storage, and they'll be ready to go into the ground later. Okay, one question that people have, and I had, was if I have a clump that has a tuber with a broken neck, but it's not broken all the way through, is it still going to be okay? And how do I tell? In this case, there's actually 2 tubers that got damaged in storage or when they were getting taken out of the ground. And you can see with one of them, I'm going to be real careful here. With one of them, you can actually see inside where the neck has started to lace, and you can see it's drying out. That will not work at all. So this guy, we would go ahead and just cut off here before we divide to get rid of him. But this guy has a crack here, and you can see it's still attached. And so I'm going to actually try and save this one and see, but you can see it hasn't gone through. There's no lacing. It's not dried out. And so it might work. But to be sure, if you were if you were needed to be 100%, you would say, nah, I'm not going to risk it. But if you're just going to try it and put it in the ground, that one might be viable, but the other one definitely was not.
Let us know what other questions you may have. We're happy to dive into more dahlia dividing tips and tricks that we've learned along the way. And we will definitely be bringing you along as we get these planted into our own gardens. And as they grow this season, we'll be sure to share exactly how we stake ours, how we fertilize them, and all the fun of enjoying them once they're blooming.